It is time. There he goes. It's time for us to get started. In fact, it's a couple minutes past time. So if you'd be finding a place to sit down, then we will begin our class this evening. Danny just said we may have to set a bomb out there in the foyer, but they'll get in here eventually. We're in Mark still as we continue our study of the Gospel of Mark, and we're in chapter 12 this evening. And I'm hoping, I'll tell you like I did last week, got a lot of ground to cover, because I really want to cover all of chapter 12 this evening if we can. If we can't, then I'd rather you understand what we do than just to get through the material. But I'm hoping we can do that, because chapter 13 is one of those chapters that you really need to cover the whole thing all at once and get the context all together. I sometimes will talk about this as a bad chapter break here, or this is a bad chapter break here. In fact, at the beginning of chapter 12, I told you it's a bad chapter break that you can lose the context if you don't really pay attention. But chapter 13 actually is a really good chapter break, and it's one thought that we really need to study out through. But we'll see how far we can get this evening anyway as we think about where we've been the last couple of weeks. Of course, last week we talked about from the end of chapter 11 and into chapter 12 the different ways that people were seeing Jesus. And of course, we ended on that parable of the vine growers, which is really important. Now, we also talked about, as we began that section, we talked about the parable of the fig tree, and you need to think about that and what it represents of these people, these Jewish leaders, the religious leaders that like the fig tree, they had the signs that they ought to be producing fruit. They looked the part, but they weren't actually producing any fruit. And we're going to see that thought continue as we go forward. But the parable of the vine growers, where you had the religious leaders for the first time really understanding, hey, he told that parable about us. And he knows what we're up to, what we're planning to do to eventually kill the Son. So that's kind of going to set the scene for what we're going to talk about tonight, and some of the opposition that Jesus is going to face from these religious leaders. And then the widow's mite is a teaching section, but I'll show you as we get there how it connects with the previous section before it. But mainly what we're talking about tonight is the different ways that these religious leaders now are ramping up the intensity of how they're opposing Jesus as we're nearing the end of this gospel, and of course, Jesus' eventual death on the cross. So this first section, verses 13 through 17, the Pharisees and Herodians test Jesus politically. They've tried to test him religiously, and they have found that, we can't get one over on him when we start talking Bible with him. He knows the Bible a little bit better than we do, which was probably shocking to them, but of course, it's not to us. But as you get into verse 13, it says, they sent to him some of the Pharisees, and you wonder who's the they. Who is this the they that's sending these guys? It's probably, I would say, the top guys in the temple, the high priests, and the ones that really were the very top of the chain, so to speak, in the religious hierarchy that they had. But they sent to him some of the Pharisees. These are the religious leaders of the people, and some of the Herodians. These are the political leaders of the people. And we looked at way back earlier in Mark how that, this is two groups that would not have anything to do with each other, but when they're starting to work together, it tells you how desperate they are to bring Jesus down. The Herodians were Jews that would have been the ones that the Romans put into place, the family and the servants, the people connected with King Herod. So this is the monarchy that the Romans have put into place. Okay, so the people, the Jewish people, would have considered the high priest to be really the head, the leader of the people at this point. But politically, from the Romans aspect, the Herodians are the ones that are in charge, and now they're in league together. And the reason why is because they're going to try to test him politically. So verse 14, they come to him and said to him, now notice how they butter him up here. Teacher, have they ever considered Jesus a teacher? No, but they're trying to butter him up here. We know that you are true. Have they ever considered anything Jesus said to be true? Well, of course not. And do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed at appearances. And your translation may have something different. This is kind of a hard thing to translate. It's literally look at man's face. It's two compound words for look at man's face. But that's the idea that he's talking about here. I think this is it's not a word-for-word translation here, but it conveys the thought that's behind it. But truly teach the way of God. Now, if they really thought that he was truly teaching the way of God, what would they have done? They'd have followed him. Or, to put it in Mark's terminology, they would have denied self, taken up their cross, and followed him, right? But they haven't been doing that. They're here trying to verse 13 says, to trap him. Okay? So they're not concerned. They're just buttering him up. They're trying to, if we get him, we catch him off guard, if we get him to relax a little bit and make him think we're on his side. Is it lawful to pay, now the ESV says taxes, but it's singular here. And if you're reading a New American Standard, it may say poll tax, or some other translations just say tax. But this is a specific tax that they're referring to. Is it lawful to pay tax to Caesar or not? Should we pay them? It should be it or not. So the tax that they're referencing, and we know that because of what he's going to talk about with the denarius, and the tax that they're referencing, this poll tax or a census tax, it's sometimes called. This was a tax that the people of Israel hated for a couple of reasons. Number one, it wasn't really about the amount. A denarius was a day's wage. So you think about if the IRS showed up and said, all you owe us this year is what you made in one day. I would take that in a heartbeat, wouldn't y'all? But it's not the amount that's the problem here. This is one of those taxes that every time they counted them, they'd make them pay this tax. So this was a reminder tax that we're in control of you, which the Jews hated. And the other thing that they hated was they had to pay a denarius for it, and we'll talk about in just a minute why that coin was so offensive to them. So, but that's the question. And if you think about it, it's a pretty good question if you're trying to trick somebody, because if Jesus says, no, you shouldn't pay the tax, then the Herodians can run back to Rome and say, hey, you've got a guy that's trying to get the people all fired up to go against Rome. And if he says, yes, we should pay the tax, then the Pharisees can go to all the synagogues throughout the land and tell them, hey, this Jesus, he's in cahoots with the Romans and you shouldn't follow him. So it's a really, if you think about it from a debate standpoint, it's a really good question for them to ask him. So should we pay it or not? But verse 15, here's the problem. Even with all the buttering up, even as good of a test question as that was, but knowing their hypocrisy. See, he knows that they've got that play-acting face like, we like you, and you're such a good teacher, and this is something we're really struggling with, and we hope that you will. And by the way, we do this sometimes ourselves. I've seen preachers, even preacher friends of mine, that'll put something on Facebook, and it's like, I've been studying this passage, and I just like to know what's your opinion on it. And Danny will get on there and, well, I think what he's talking about here is such and such. And then the next comment is, Danny is a reprobate, and he's, we set him up. Say, well, that's what they're trying to do. But Jesus knows that's what they're trying to do. So he asked them, why do you put me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me look at it. Again, it's a day's wage, and it's what they used for this tax. So they brought him one, verse 16, and he said to them, whose likeness and inscription is this? So here's one of the reasons why they really hated this particular coin. It had Tiberius Caesar's image on it, but here's the inscription that it also had on it. I can't do it that way. Let me try to do it this way. Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus. So what they're claiming is that Augustus is a god, and Tiberius is then the son of a god, right? And then on the backside, he calls himself, the backside of the coin, he's the highest priest. Now, the Jews were led by the high priest, but here is the highest priest. Now put yourself in a first century Jewish mindset. Can you imagine why that would offend them just a little bit? It's also interesting, we talked about in the introductory material with Mark about one of the archaeological facts that we found that kind of proves some of what's going on or connects with some of this is we found that that monument to, or that writing that is to Tiberius Caesar that talks about it being the gospel of Tiberius Caesar, the good news about Tiberius Caesar, and it goes on to talk about how he's the Savior of the people everywhere he goes and provides for them all they need. It's very messianic kind of language or gospel kind of language. And so there's a lot of people that actually think maybe that Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark as a retaliation against the Gospel of Tiberius Caesar. And there's a lot of writing about, of course, this kind of thing in the Gospel of Mark. But you can see why they, of all things, they would have really hated this tax because of what's behind it, but also this coin that they had to give that claims that he is not only the son of a god, but that he is the highest priest. So he asked them, whose likeness and inscription is this? And they said to him, Caesar. Jesus said to them, render, which is a word we don't use very often. If we do, it's about rendering bacon fat usually, is the only way that I use the word render. But the word that's translated render just means to restore to the original possessor or to return to. So you find something or you have something that belongs to someone else, and I've got Charles's billfold, I'm going to bring it back to Charles. I'm going to render it to him, restore it to him. Now, that's not what we're doing with bacon fat. We're actually taking it away from the pig, but it's that's the idea behind this word. So what Jesus says is, whose image and likeness is on it? What inscription is on it? They said Caesar, and he said so. Give back to Caesar what's his. That coin belongs to Caesar. And so Caesar can demand to have it at any time he wants to, right? That's the way it is even with our money. That's my money. No, really, it's the property of the United States of America, and they can take it back if they want to. And they do sometimes. So render to Caesar what Caesar's. Give back to Caesar because that really belongs to him. That's no big deal. But then notice the other half of that section. He says, and, it's the same verb that would be carried over here. So render to God the things that are God's. So what does God want? Well, if you flip back to chapter 11, and you remember in chapter 11, in verse 11, when Jesus gets into town in Jerusalem and he looks around at the temple and everything that's going on after that triumphal entry, and we talked about how that's when he's noticing, that's the reason why he comes back the next day and cleanses the temple, because he's seeing these are people that have not denied self and let God reign. They're trying to reign and rule themselves. They're not willing to give God their hearts. And then you look over at chapter 12 and verse 2, and when you think about that parable that we talked about with the man that owns the vineyard, at harvest time he sent a slave to the vine growers in order to receive some of the produce. What was wrong with the fig tree? Well, the fig tree looked like it should have had produce on it, but it hadn't produced none. And it was a reminder of the way the religious leaders, the religious elite, the people were acting. They showed these signs that they should be showing fruit, but they haven't. So what does God want? He wants fruit. He wants your heart. He wants you to let Him reign and rule in your life. And instead, they're trying to reign and rule. They won't give their heart to Him. And they marveled at Him. And this is one of those amazed words that we've talked about all through the Gospel of Mark. This one means they were astonished. And it was probably because, hey, this is the question we'll get him on. And then they're walking back to camp going, how in the world did he get out of that? I just knew we had him cornered, But they're amazed. They're astonished that he was able to get out of it. Yes, sir? Well, it could be, yeah. Because the whole thing about the coin is this divine, God-like deal, and it's right the opposite of what they should have been focused on for sure. Yeah, God, we talked about with the vineyard that God's the one that created the vineyard, not the people that they put in charge of it. God's the one that built the wall. God's the one that tilled it. God's the one that planted it. God's the one that watered it. And the only reason we're here is because He made us in His image. He gave us everything we needed. And, we sometimes look around and say, look at what we did. Well, how much of that did we really do without God's help? And so, it's definitely the idea that, that coin belongs to Him because His image is on it. So give it to Him. But you belong to God. But you're not acting like it. You're acting like I'm large and in charge, and I can be not only in control of what I want to do, but these religious leaders where I'm in charge of God's kingdom, which is really problematic about it. All right, so the next opposition we see in chapter 12, beginning verse 18, is with the Sadducees. And he's going to define for us who the Sadducees are in just a moment. But the Sadducees are going to challenge Jesus about the resurrection, which is interesting because of who they were. In Acts 23 and verse 8, it gives us a deeper discussion about who the Sadducees were. We sometimes talk about denominationalism, and we'll talk about how that's something that happened since Jesus established His church. Well, denominationalism has always been around. Even in the days of Jesus, when it came to the people of Israel. You had the Pharisees, and you had the Sadducees, and you had the Essenes, and you had all these separate groups that had divided themselves off and said, we're going to believe this, and we're not going to believe that, and we're going to believe this, and we're not going to believe that. And when you look at the Sadducees, of course, he's going to point out here in verse 18, they said that there was no resurrection. But the other part about the Sadducees that's interesting that Matthew 23 teaches us about is they didn't believe in angels. They didn't really believe in a spirit world. They didn't believe, this is a good thing, but they didn't believe that, we've talked about the Pharisees had elevated the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Pharisaical teachings or commentaries on the text. They had elevated the commentaries to being equal with the text. Well, the Sadducees didn't go for that. They said all of that the Pharisees are teaching, well, it was because they didn't like the Pharisees is why. It wasn't noble, really, but they didn't go for what this Pharisaical teaching, they didn't elevate. We should just go by the text, they said, which is something that we would agree with them. So that's some good things, and they had some bad things. But what's interesting is, of all the things that they believed and did not believe, when the Sadducees come to Jesus to ask a question, they ask a question about the resurrection, which tells us right off the bat that this isn't really a question they really care about because they don't think there even is a resurrection. Are you with me? It would be like me going up to my brother who's a Kentucky fan and saying, what do you think Kentucky's basketball team's going to look like this year? And he's going to say, what do you care? And I say, I don't, Well, that's the Sadducees. They're walking up to Jesus and saying, what about the resurrection? And Jesus is going to say, what do you care about the resurrection? And if they were truthful, they would say, well, we don't, because we don't think there is. So the problem that they're going to lay out is as far-fetched, and he'll talk about the reasons why that it's wrong. It's as far-fetched and it's wrong thinking. It's also one of those hypotheticals that we like to come up with sometimes, and it's just so far out there. But all of it's based on there being a resurrection, and you don't think there's a resurrection, so what are you worried about it for? And that ends up being the point here. So the Sadducees came to him who say there is no resurrection. By the way, if you'll jump down to verse 23, there's the beginning of their question when they finally get to it. In the resurrection. If they don't believe in the resurrection, why are they asking about the resurrection? So if you'd like to write in your Bible, maybe circle this in verse 18 and draw a line down to that section in verse 23. But they asked him this question, saying, Teacher. Now again, do they think Jesus is a teacher? No, or they'd be following him. But notice what they start with. Moses wrote. Every time a religious leader had asked Jesus a religious question up to this point, what was Jesus' answer always? have you not read what Moses said? Let's go to the text and see. So at least they're starting off with, hey, we'll just start off with Moses, and then he won't tell us to go there. Actually, just because you're using Scripture doesn't mean you're using it right, which is a problem that they're going to face. But they start with that at least. Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife but leaves no child, the man must take his widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now, this is the Levirate law that's found in Deuteronomy chapter 25 and verse 5. And what they're telling is true, that it was something that God put into the law of Moses for the sake of the people. And it may seem weird and maybe even disgusting to us, but in that culture, and we've talked about this before, but in that culture, if you're a widow and you don't have a son to take care of you, then that means you're desolate, you're homeless, you're poor, you have no way to make a living, you can't own land, you can't own anything on your own. So a widow at that time especially was in a really bad situation. Now, in our terms, in our time now today, you could be a widow and your husband dies, you not have any children, but you just inherited his life insurance policy and everything he owns, and you may be someone who does a lot of good, giving that to others or whatever, but you couldn't do that in that time. So what are we going to do? Well, if that case, and it would be a rarity that someone who was a widow didn't have a son and her husband were to die, but if it happened, here's a way that we can make sure that she's taken care of. So here comes the hypothetical in their situation. What they've said so far is what Moses wrote. He says there were 7 brothers. The first took a wife. When he died, he left no offspring. And the second took her and died, leaving no offspring. And the third likewise. And the 7 left no offspring. Last of all, the woman also died. I wondered if this is where 7 brides for 7 brothers got the idea for that. But I don't know that there's any connection there. But this has gone on now with all the brothers dying and each one marrying and each one, they die before they have a son. So here's the question. After going through all of that, verse 23, now here's our question. In the resurrection that we don't believe in, verse 18, in the resurrection when they rise again, which we don't believe they will, verse 18, whose wife will she be? For the 7 had her as a wife. So, again, you can just imagine the Sadducees sitting around, and of course they don't believe in the resurrection. They don't believe that they're going to be raised, and this is even going to be an issue. But this may have been even something that as the Sadducees talk to people who were non-Sadducees, we make up our questions and our debates to try to get people, and maybe this was something that they commonly used. I don't know, but surely as they're sitting around thinking about this, they're thinking, now we've got Jesus on this one because he believes in a resurrection. He's talked about a resurrection. He can't answer this question. So, verse 24, Jesus said to them, is this not the reason? You are wrong. Well, tell us what you really think about it, Jesus. And if you will, here's one of those bookends we talk about. If someone's talking about something here and talking about something here, guess what they're talking about in between here? See, this is one of the ways that they're showing us this whole section is about. If you look down at verse 27, at the end of this particular section, he says, you are quite wrong. It's the same exact language that he used up in verse 24. So in verse 24, he starts and says, this is the reason you are wrong. And then he's going to explain why they are wrong. And then verse 27 conclude with, you are quite wrong. And really what he's going to give them is 2 reasons why they're wrong in verse 24. Number 1, because you know neither the Scriptures, you don't really know what the Bible says. You're quoting verses, but you don't really know what it says or really know what it's talking about. And sometimes we do that. Where 2 or more gathered in His name, so, when we're on that fishing boat, there's 2 of us there, so we can have a worship. Do you really know in that Scripture what he's talking about is church discipline? He's not talking about assembling for worship. Oh, Or, we're going to the big game tonight, Philippians 4:13. Did you realize winning a championship is not what Philippians 4:13 is? So we'll use passages sometimes that really have nothing to do with what we're talking about. And that's what he's saying. You're using this Levirate law, which was something for here on this earth, and you're trying to apply it in a way that it was never intended to be applied. So you don't know the Scriptures. Number two, you don't know the power of God, because you're thinking that this is something that you can figure out. And I've got written up here 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 15 through 16, where Peter talks about those people that will take the Scriptures and they'll try to twist it or wrestle with it or something. That's really the word for it that it's translated from is a word not really like wrestling was bad enough. You ever watch some of those? I'm not talking about wrestling now. I'm talking about wrestling. But if you're talking, and there's a difference, right? If you're talking about wrestling, some of the holds that they put them in is pretty bad. This is more the idea if you've been over to Discovery Park and you go in that little room and it's got those medieval torture chambers, how they would twist and contort bodies in ways that they weren't supposed to twist and contort. That's the word for this. You're twisting and contorting the Scriptures in ways that they were never meant to be used. And that's what they're doing, because they think they're the ones that should be in charge of the text rather than the text being in control of them. So, verse 25, he says, "For when they rise from the dead," not if, but when they rise from the dead. This is a fact. And you don't even accept that, but it's a fact that they're going to rise from the dead. "They neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven." See, what you're assuming is that what goes on in this earth necessarily translate to what goes on in heaven. That because that a husband and wife is married on this earth, that means that they are married in heaven. But marriage is something that was given on earth for mankind on earth, but it's not something that is going to, we even talk about till death do us part, right? And I know it's sometimes something we think about, excuse me, or talk about that will sometimes give us peace when we think about our widow or our widower, that, your husband or your wife that's deceased, that one day you'll be reunited in heaven, and we will be if we're faithful followers of Jesus. But the reward won't be that we get to be married again. The reward will be that we're faithful followers of Jesus and that we're there together as part of His family, there together for eternity. Yes, sir. Well, two of you talking at the same time. Go ahead. Well, that's a longer subject than we have. In fact, one of you asked for it later in the year, and we had a ton of questions put in the box about that. And in a nutshell, we're not told a whole lot about it. We're told a lot more about being ready for our death or for the day of judgment than we are actually what's going to happen afterwards. We're told that the soul leaves the body, and so we are bodiless beings for a while. We're told, and even there's the spirits of those who were underneath the floor of heaven, crying out to God in Revelation, for justice to be done and that type of thing. But they're bodiless spirits, and then at some point, there's going to be a resurrection. We're going to be changed. We're going to have a new body. What that's going to be like, I have no idea. The easy answer to tell you is that whatever it is, it's far greater and better than anything than we can imagine. But what exactly it's going to be like, I don't know. I wish I did. Ron?
I was just going to say, I had a boss that was a Mormon,
Mm-hmm.
and so that they could be married in heaven.
Hmm.
I pointed out this scripture to him, but I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, Jesus would have said, "Is this not why you're wrong?" But you know that's all we really know. Now, you know, there's a whole another you asked for it. We're going to do about angels because there's lots of questions about angels. I always I try to when I do question and answer things that there are questions that I can say I know because I can take you to a text and say this is what God says. And then there are questions that I can say I don't know because the Bible doesn't really tell us. And then there's some texts or some questions rather that I can say I think. And the Bible doesn't necessarily say it point blank, but it gives us a few hints here and there and based on some biblical principles. Does that make sense? So when we're talking about what happens after we die, what's going to happen for eternity with us, Van, it's one of those where there's a little bit I can tell you that I know. There's a whole lot that I think, and there's a whole lot more that I don't have any idea. And those areas where we're talking about I think and I don't know is where we need to give each other some grace and not draw lines of fellowship and whatnot. But you know, it's one of the and honestly, I don't know how much y'all keep up with what's going on in the brotherhood and writings, whatever. I don't know that you need to do that, by the way, but that's one of the things that's hotly debated right now, is what happens to us in eternity. And you know, it's one of those deals that I think Wayne Berger, who was just here a few weeks ago with our personal evangelism seminar, puts it best. He said, you know, what we're really saying if we're trying to draw lines of you're right and I'm wrong on these issues is we're saying that we're going to get to the judgment day and Jesus is going to say, now you were a faithful follower, you were a good man, good woman, good mama, good daddy, good husband, good wife, you did all these things right, you handled your sin appropriately, but because you don't know what happens next, I'm not going to let you in. Now, that's a little far-fetched, but I know we're going to have a new body, a resurrected. You know, sometimes people will say, only two things you got to do. What's the two things everybody says you have to do? Die and pay taxes. You don't have to do either one of those. Now, don't go to your IRS agent and say, our preacher said we didn't. Lots of people don't pay taxes. You should pay your taxes. Let me go on the record in case they're watching. You should pay your taxes, but you don't have to pay your taxes. Sometimes people don't. And you may not die because Jesus may come back before you do. The two things you have to do is you have to be changed, either through death or those of us that are still here, we're going to be given a new body. What's that going to be like? I have no idea, but we're going to be changed in some way or fashion. And then we're all going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ. So I like to use that, especially with my boys. When I can't do that because I have to. No, you don't really have to do that. There's only two things I know. We got to be changed and face the judgment. I know, you know. But what that change is going to be is one of those hard questions because we just don't really know. It's an eternal body, but what it is, I don't know. All right, so, but that's the point that he's making here is that you're trying to apply what's happened on earth, saying it's going to be just like that in heaven, and that's not necessarily the case. And then he says, and as for the dead, in some of your translations, what even includes the word fact here, it's not really there in the original language, but it certainly is the point that he's making. As for the fact of the dead being raised, have you not read, here we go, Larry, they started with Moses, but he has to point them right back to Moses. Have you not read in the book of Moses, this goes back up to verse 19, in the passage about the bush, that's Exodus 3 with the burning bush, how that God spoke to him saying, I am the God of Abraham. Now, when God's speaking to Moses at the burning bush, what was Abraham's state? Where was Abraham at when God's speaking to Moses at the burning bush? He's dead, okay? And I'm the God of Isaac. Where was Isaac when God's talking to Moses at the burning bush? He's dead. And the God of Jacob. Where was Jacob when God's speaking to Moses in the burning bush? He's dead. But yet, notice that he says, I am. Not I was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, even though they're dead. Now, we've already seen in this gospel account when Moses and Elijah, who were dead, were in front of Peter, James, and John on the Mount of Transfiguration. Who were they? Who did they call them? The two guys standing next to Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. Maybe my question's harder than the answer sometimes. Moses and Elijah. They're dead, but they're still who? Moses and Elijah. See, just the present tense, the tense of the verb, tells you something about God. He says, I am the God of dead Abraham, dead Isaac, and dead Jacob. Because they're dead. Remember, he's talking to Sadducees who think that when you're dead, when you die, you're like Rover, you're dead all over. You know, there's nothing about you living anymore. But after they're dead, he says, I am, present tense, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So what should you draw from that? Verse 27. He is not the God of the dead. And it's actually an interesting word that he uses here. He doesn't use the Greek word for the dead. He uses the Greek word for the corpses, which is kind of Halloweenish kind of sounding. But when Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob died, they didn't just become corpses stuck in the ground and God's saying, I'm the God of these dead corpses. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob died, there was an eternal part of them that's still living. You with me? So he's not the God of the dead corpses, but of the living. You are quite wrong. The very premise on which all of this is based in your life is that you think there is no such thing as life beyond the grave. And I'm telling you, you're not even knowing what the Bible said. Moses said this. Well, here's what Moses said, is that God said, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who were dead, but they were still alive. And that is a comfort to us to know that when someone we love dies, their corpse is here, their corpse died, but they're still living. And God, if He was their God in this life, He's still their God in that life. So that's the way that He puts this opposition down. Now, we don't have time, as much as I wish we did, we don't have time to go through the rest of chapter 12, but you're going to have a scribe that's going to come up now and ask Jesus a question. And the way it's presented in Mark is that it doesn't present it as at first at least, as an opposition. But I want you to, if you would, read through the rest of chapter 12 before next week. And also, if you go to Matthew 22, is Matthew's account of this same scribe coming and asking this question about the greatest commandment. And read what Matthew says, because Matthew says that he came to him to test him. And I think that's what he's really doing here, but after he starts answering, the scribe begins to change his mind, which says something about him for sure. But anyway, read the rest of chapter 12. Read Matthew 22's section about that, if you would, before next week, and we'll cover that next week. Before we dismiss this evening, we've got a couple of